You might want to strap on because this is a big one. I had long suspected that the figurine dolls, often termed Venus figurines, the stone female figures that are discovered during the Paleolithic period, that they may not be what we always assumed them to be. Venus dolls were most commonly discovered dating between 26,000 and 21,000 years ago, with the oldest example dating around 35,000 years, and the latest example arguably around 11,000 years ago, though some newer versions might have been discovered. There's great contention in the academic circles whether Venus dolls are religious figurines, with other academic circles believing it to be a form of erotic art, or perhaps made to exaggerate the symbolism of fertility. Either way, what all sides do agree on is that the dolls have distorted anatomy of sorts, especially in the pelvic region and other sexual organs. Now, some believe the dolls to be pregnant, but that doesn't seem to be indicative of most of the dolls. Other theories include it to be anatomically accurate from the people of the Khoisan tribe. The only issue is there's been no Venus dolls that have ever been discovered in Africa. Now, one theory that I have yet to hear, however, the one that makes most sense to me, is that Venus dolls are not made by humans. And no, I'm not thinking aliens either. Perhaps it wasn't Homo Sapiens that were responsible for the dolls, rather Homo Neanderthalensis, most commonly known as Neanderthals, or the Geico cavemen. Now, sounds far-fetched? Well, stay tuned to find out why we think we may just have enough evidence to support this crazy little idea. Neanderthals, aka cavemen. They came into existence somewhere around 400,000 years ago and died, according to fossil records, as early as 40,000 years ago, though we believe that might be a little bit different. They dominated European mountainous regions, but also thrived in Russia, and some recent findings seem to indicate they inhabited locations like Israel, stretching across some Middle Eastern pockets. Now, why would some random YouTuber believe that Neanderthals were responsible for the creation of Venus dolls, while the entire academic circle got it all wrong? Well, for starters, it wouldn't be the first time academics got this topic incorrect. The El Castillo caves in Spain were recently dated via the red pigment used in the caves to be 64,800 years old. The only problem is that back then there were no modern humans in the area. The only remaining contenders would be Neanderthals. But cavemen doing art? Aren't they supposed to be stupid or something? This is a misconception, likely aggravated by the stereotype of them being cave people. In fact, Neanderthals were much smarter than previously assumed. In the Smithsonian article titled, "What Do We Really Know About Neanderthals?" it states, "A new body of research has emerged that's transformed our images of Neanderthals. Through advances in archaeology, dating, genetics, biological anthropology, and many related disciplines, we know that Neanderthals not only had bigger brains than sapiens, but also walked upright and had a greater lung capacity. These Ice Age Eurasians were skilled toolmakers and big game hunters who lived in large social groups, built shelters, traded jewelry, wore clothing, ate plants, and cooked them, and made stick pitches to secure their spot points by heating birch bark. Evidence is mounting that Neanderthals had a complex language, and even given the care to which they buried their dead, had some form of spirituality. And as the cave art in Spain demonstrates, these early settlers had the chutzpah to enter an unwelcoming underground environment using fire to light the way. Going further with this, it was reported that Neanderthals were discovered in Israel dating to 60,000 years ago. Now, according to Hertz.com, obviously Neanderthals had to leave their rock shelters to spear woolly rhinos and whatnot, but otherwise, they were thought to have stayed close to the cave. Yet, the In-Kashish bones were found out in the open, indicating that they had a life beyond the confines of the rock walls, adding they were not in danger of extinction at the time. Now remember this last point, because we're actually going to come back to this at the end. Now, CNN even remarked in an article called Bones Uncovered: Mysterious Early History of the Neanderthals that, quote, a study published in the journal PLOS ONE found that Neanderthals repeatedly occupied an open-air settlement rather than a cave in Israel between 54,000 and 71,000 years ago. Surprisingly enough, there have been multiple Venus figurines discovered in Israel and the surrounding area. This is strange, since the discoveries of both the dolls and the Neanderthal fossils, each in and of itself, were thought to be an anomaly of sorts in their respective field of research. Venus figurines and Neanderthal bones have also been discovered in Iraq. Yep, I kid you not. Now, going further with this idea, the science article states Neanderthal presence in Germany can be dated back 60,000 to 40,000 years before our time. Now, it so happens that some of the German Venus figurines, made of mammoth ivory of all things, discovered oftentimes in grave sites, well, they date back as far as 40,000 years ago. Now, this is also true for Russia, Italy, the French mountains, the Pyrenees mountains, the Iberian Peninsula, Northern Europe, just south of the British Isles, and the Czech Republic. Wow. Upon initially investigating this hunch, I had no idea that locations would match so perfectly. So, I decided to pinpoint the exact location of some of the most prominent figurine dolls discovered on Google Earth. Then I contorted a map of the Neanderthal land to match this Google Earth map, and here's what we got. Now, these dots depict the locations where Venus figurine dolls were discovered. Look how closely they match the actual Neanderthal land. So if that wasn't enough, consider this new research of Neanderthals and their anatomy. So, it seems Neanderthals were more than capable of making these dolls, not just through their intelligence, but also through their anatomy. Talking about anatomy, one of the main descriptions given by the Wikipedia on the anatomy of the Venus figurines is, quote, roughly losange shaped. In some examples, certain parts of the human anatomy are exaggerated: abdomen, hips, breasts, thighs, vulva. Now, I didn't know this, but losange shape means more like a form of rhombus. Now, let's compare the anatomical skeleton of a Neanderthal versus Homo Sapiens. Looks like the difference is something like that Neanderthal looks more rhombus shaped. And I would say it would make the Venus dolls look a little bit less exaggerated. Now, to make this point more clear, I went ahead and decided to do a 3D rendering of the Venus of Brachypui, dated around 25,000 years, and an actual depiction of what the Neanderthals were thought to have looked like. Take a look. Another interesting piece of evidence is that the Venus of Willendorf, discovered in Austria, and the Venus of Locelle, discovered in France, were uniquely and mysteriously covered in red ocher, which seems to create more questions than answers for archaeologists. Now, what interested me the most is that the same cave paintings that academics mistakenly took for being painted by Homo sapiens instead of the true artists, the Neanderthals, well, it so happens that those cave paintings were painted, according to the Smithsonian magazine, in red ocher, the same pigment material that was discovered around the aforementioned Venus dolls. I kid you not. Now, one last thing to consider is the possible art style of Neanderthals. Now, very little has been discovered in this department, but if you're to draw out general conclusions like linear repeating lines in a form of pointillism as something that can be ascribed to their art, or certainly some of the art associated with the Venus dolls, they seem to fit in a general sense. I'm guessing by now you're starting to get the point. But why are academics so slow to pick this up? Well, it seems that the dates don't quite align. If Neanderthal really went extinct around 40,000 years ago, then they would not have been around in time to make some of the dolls. Here's the thing. it's only presumed that Neanderthals went extinct around that time, because 40,000 years is supposedly the youngest date ascribed to a Neanderthal fossil. So their evidence is actually based on a lack of evidence, which, as the famous aphorism goes, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when you consider what was transpiring between 40,000 years ago and 12,000 years ago, which was the Ice Age, prior to the Younger Dryas, the Mini Ice Age. In fact, if you examine human fossil records of that time, you'll see that it's not just Neanderthals that have an unusual scarcity of fossils from that time, indicating that climatic changes may have affected populations or perhaps even the fossil record itself. Lastly, could Gobekli Tepe, the oldest megalithic site discovered in Turkey 12,000 years ago, actually be evidence that Neanderthals survived much later, as far back as 12,800 years ago? Let's listen in.
Based on all anatomical evidence that we can find of the post-Solutrean culture, what they look like, what they wore, and their sophisticated garb they wore, tailored clothes. And I'm going to show you now what we believe these people look like. This is the closest I think you're going to come. Notice the very large jaws, very high, the forehead, very thick foreheads, very long. There's the female here. Obviously notice the belts, these are the belts from Gobekli Tepe. Obviously shamanic aspects. Here's them in full garb. And if people say, oh, they didn't look like that, and then they did. They had this type of tailored clothing as early as 25,000 BC. Okay, these are reindeer hunters, shamans, virtual messianic figures that turned up just at the right time, and I think created Gobekli Tepe. More pictures of them here. I mean, you know, you don't want to mess with these people, do you really? Just for completion, that's what we think the female looked like. Again, based on anatomical evidence, knowledge of the head deformation as well. Moreover, there is evidence that the Swiderians were Neanderthal human hybrids. And this comes from anatomical evidence that's been associated with their culture, which shows that they were extremely long-headed individuals, with strong brow ridges, large jaws, and other so-called archaic human features. And the first person to connect them with this was the famous Lithuanian archaeologist and prehistorian Marija Gumbatus, who was a very, very, very clever woman and written various books, as many of you will probably know. They had what's known as an occipital bun here, which you can see here, okay? And it would seem as if the hybrids inherited this, as we'll see. And this is very, very important. I mean, this is a skull from a place called the Shanidar Cave in Upper Iraq. And it dates about 60,000 years old. It's Neanderthal. And you can see just how extended this skull actually is.
So, if the inhabitants responsible for the creation of Gobekli Tepe were hybrids, surely a pure Neanderthal race couldn't have been extinct too many generations before. To some, this might seem as a surprise that the inhabitants of Gobekli Tepe were so tall, given that they were half Neanderthal. But this is something that I actually always assumed might be the case. You see, oftentimes in biology, when you cross species, for example, a lion and a tiger, the results ends up being something that is much bigger, a biological gigantism process. In other words, it's very feasible that a hybrid species that is capable of breeding could have similar biological triggers towards increasing size in mixed species. Now, that instantly lit up some lights in my head and thinking of the giants of the Bible. Could these have been various admixes of Homo Sapiens and Homo Neanderthalis mixes? I know this sounds kind of crazy, but consider that one of the last stories regarding giants occurred in Afghanistan during the Afghan War. Now, I'm not sure if the story is real or not, but I found it interesting that Afghanistan also happens to be a site where Neanderthal fossils were discovered. Now, lastly, I would argue that it may not have been humans itself who brought Neanderthals to extinction. Rather, the same cosmic catastrophe that did away with Atlantis if the inhabitants of Gobekli Tepe were also giants of sorts, then the date of the catastrophe matches very closely to when Gobekli Tepe was covered in sediments. So I would argue it was around 12,800 years ago when that comet struck Greenland, and other fragments apparently struck much of North America, Europe, and perhaps even portions of Turkey. Now, perhaps the anatomical difference in the sudden climactic changes, meaning the Neanderthals had less endurance to seek shelter, well, maybe that's what played into their extinction, at least more so than human wars. Now, it's true, humans did war with Neanderthals, and it's just that the extinction process, kind of like the extinction of the mammoths, that is assumed to be from human hands and not from some kind of climactic catastrophe, but I don't think either theory has any proof. Now, in the book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, the author makes a great point that one of the defining traits that allows humans to survive is their unique ability to take arbitrary concepts and unify them under a common symbol, kind of like a flag. Now, Neanderthals had to trust everyone that they knew, so groups couldn't accumulate much past 150 individuals, yet humans could simply identify with a flag, which is part of our unique cognitive ability in comparison to Neanderthals. Subsequently, this made it easier for humans to set up armies of thousands under one flag. Now, though the war theory seems like a likely candidate of what drove Neanderthals to extinction, this concept of a catastrophe actually simplifies things. It doesn't make it more complicated. Now, if it can be determined that Neanderthals lived past 40,000 years, surely it seems reasonable to assume that a major catastrophe could have played a major role in this epic human story. Now, if you enjoyed this content, you can do me a favor and just tell your friends about it. Now, if YouTube chooses to continue to censor our content with episodes like these, to be honest with you, there's very little I can do other than sound like a complainer. But frankly, I'm kind of tired of that. And I'm tired of announcing my frustrations. So in truth, I'm gonna find a way to find this message and get it to other platforms, and hopefully videos like this will serve as evidence for the potential scientific discoveries YouTube's censorship has suppressed with this channel and other channels like it, meaning truth-seeking channels for the sake of truth as opposed to profit. Now, if you want to help us continue to grow, you can do so by sharing this video. It's the best way to help us when we become irrelevant in the algorithms. Thanks again for joining me. This is Felipe Osorio, signing out.